Czy jesteśmy technicznie gotowi?
Are we technically ready? Yes, we are. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I have the pleasure to invite Dean of the Academy of the War Science General Brigade, Dr. Professor Kosowski, to open our conference. Dean, please open the conference. Distinguished guests, students, ladies and gentlemen. In the very beginning, I'd like to express my thanks to all of you for coming to such an important scientific event entitled Science About Security, a decade of experience that was covered by honorary of the 20th centuries was the witness of deep changes in security, the effect of which was ending of the Cold War and disintegration of the Soviet Union. This was translated into the security situation, so its importance moved from the purely military to other domains, and this resulted in extending of the research area for people dealing with research on security. In our country, this was noticed by both representatives of military scientists, but also some political scientists. And in the result of the actions undertaken based on regulation of the Minister of Higher Education, a new discipline was created, Sciences on Security. Very soon, this was within the domain of interest of many universities. There were many publications on the problems of security. This year, 10 years passed from creating the science on security. So this is a good opportunity to review the status of those sciences, and also as an opportunity to meet many representatives of those universities to present their scientific work method and to present some further directions of development of this discipline. The presence of such distinguished people within the scientific committee guarantees high quality of this conference. At the same time, I'd like to congratulate the organizational committee for their commitment. Summaries, magnificences, professors, distinguished guests. It's an enormous honor for me to open this conference. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, Dean, thank you very much for your speech. 10 years passed from creating sciences on security. We may ask how this happened, that these sciences emerged. It can be said that on one hand we were lucky enough. On our side, we know that international relations with more than 100-year histories are still not a scientific domain, and here our emerging concept has become an official scientific discipline. A partial explanation is during our further discussion. On top of this, the security sciences, as it was mentioned by the Dean, were developing in a very rapid way. There were many conferences, papers, but also the applicational zone of the security science, in which we have Professor Mirosław Miękina, Professor Stanisław Sulowski. We have the pleasure to guest here. However, let me tell you that they represent various scientific communities, and together we will try to answer those career, and this allowed me to have a scientific view on this discipline. Let me tell you that research on intelligence services is present in scientific efforts, and especially this was taking place in the Academy of National Defense and the current Academy of War Sciences. We have some precious, valuable papers on theory of intelligence, special services, and their scientific aspects, and so on and so on. But I have an impression that this achievement, a question, what next? How should we research the operations of special services? In our scientific effort, we have defined what are the special services, what's the counterintelligence service. We know that intelligence service can be research using the theory of international relations and theory of realism, progressive or regressive, and that's out of any doubt, because research on intelligence shows that this institution is necessary in order to provide an advantage to the state over another state. And we may also say that the intelligence service could be seen from the point of view of constructive theory, and we may ask the question whether it's up to politicians who set missions to the intelligence services, because it should be like this. But on the other hand, this institution operating in an uncertainty area, terra incognita, this service itself can create some vision and some views on security. It's up to this institution to tell the politicians the decision to what extent this is politically verified. There is also some level of agreement about what is the intelligence service. We know that the most popular definition is that presented by Sherman Kent, who said that intelligence service is a kind of knowledge that must be obtained by any country on other countries in order to provide to itself a guarantee that as a result of ignorance of both political sciences, this is, let's say, classified operations of a state in order to understand and affect foreign reality. Or there is also another definition stating that intelligence is a specific kind of knowledge, a preemptive knowledge, allowing for formulating the security policy by informing on threats. But this informing should feature timeliness and usefulness. The intelligence service informing about threats must allow the state to create conditions to formulate some specific political decisions making.
So a definition that appears in studies of scholars dealing with intelligence and security sciences, that intelligence is activity that is to allow the state to filter out certain things from uncertain things. In an uncertain reality, there is a lot of uncertainty, so the job of intelligence is to eliminate this uncertainty and creating diagnosis which is most certain and justifying taking decisions. In security sciences, we responded what objects has intelligence activity, because many institutions use information from develop on that issue, because I think it's obvious in the form I'm telling you about. We are in a military environment. We also have knowledge about defense from intelligence. It provides support to defense planning and operating planning of the armed forces. And it's also there to economically support the economy and fighting international crime where the hands of the police, including international police organizations, cannot reach. And there we engage intelligence institutions. And the last sphere I would like to devote more attention is participation in information war. I want, of course, getting into nuances of the understanding of information war, but I concentrate mainly on content of information because intelligence deals with information. And now, ladies and gentlemen, you should ask a question whether we checked reliably intelligence in an in-depth manner. I think yes, because we have no doubts how intelligence institutions work. It's a knowledge contained in studies. We also know what are the areas, what the intelligence does, but our studies on intelligence are in a bit impoverished because we never in modern times will not learn what the content of intelligent information is, what content exists in recommendations, studies from intelligence. So we don't know how products of intelligence institutions translate into the decision-making process, and I think we'll never learn about it. We'll learn about it by post-mortem studies, so to speak. So when certain information from intelligence are no longer valid, and then historians can look into the content and on that basis analyze what impact intelligence information had on political strategic decisions, or just a question whether it had, because sometimes it happens that, as history shows us, politicians sometimes do not listen to what the intelligence has to tell them. And in this context, I would like to propose to scientists of Secret Service that we deal with a certain aspect of information war in which intelligence is heavily involved. We are used historically to ensuring that, for example, KGB overthrew governments, supported governments, recruited agents, planted them in institutions of the Western states, which then were called imperialist states. But maybe we forget that KGB conducted at least in about 40% information activity, which was there to destabilize the political and constitutional order in Western states. As one of the defectors to the West mentions, General Leo Kalugin in 1981, they say that in 1981 KGB developed 5,000 various false messages distributed in Western press. It issued about 100 books, sponsored about 70 films. So in other words, KGB was involved in an activity that in modern language we would label fake news. And I think this is the idea which permeates into the problem matter of intelligence. Namely, we should devote a lot of attention to information. I won't tell you what it is, on authors, ghost writers, so to speak, and on repeated contamination of true information. I don't want to tell you what is hidden under those notions, but the common denominator is disseminating in the hostile state of false information, because now the situation is KGB wrote articles that the US developed racial weapon to protect the whites and kill the blacks, that the United States is responsible for the death and killing of Aldo Moro, Indira Gandhi, and Olaf Palme, that AIDS is an outcome of laboratories of the US. But when we pay attention to contamination of our information space, if we pay attention to the fact that our enemy, which can be clearly defined, it is undoubtedly a very big country lying east of Poland, which we have a border with, so this country floods Poland and the EU states with false information like that they will not defend the allies, that the West is demoralized. I'm not speaking of Europe. They talk of Europe as gay Europe and say that states are so weak that they have no chance when confronted with arms. So this activity is to undermine the morale of the society, to create lack of trust with politicians. So in other words, destabilization of the state. I think that and hope that security institutions of the Polish Republic deal with this grave phenomenon in an analytical way and help eliminate those threats. And by way of terminating my speech, that's where I spot the new area for security sciences, which could be dealt with by specialists dealing with intelligence, counterintelligence, and special forces. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you for keeping the time limits, because as we probably know, we have limited time. And I also appeal to all of us to stick to time limits. I would like to ask Professor Kipler to share his reflections. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, generals, especially, I'm also addressing my PhD student, whom I'm promoting, General Sławomir Wojciechowski. And it's really a great honor for me that I was able to collaborate with such a person. Officers, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, professors, from my side, the discussion will be as follows. I proposed an ad hoc subject resulting from the problem matter of put forward to the discussion of that discussion block. And in a working manner, we can say subtitle, Security Sciences, a discipline or area of science. Professor Andrzej Brąk, a philosopher, but also Tadeusz Kotarbiński and most eminent experts on theories of science and science about science, we could say, said, as Professor Brąk said, thanks to science is a science because you identify it's the method, structure, and genesis. We'll also be discussing during the conference why this is the case. But in my paper, I will focus my attention, I will invite you to reflect upon I will add half a minute to my time, so I will focus on a number of words about the position of science, security science in the system of social sciences, but only selected aspects, and also putting forward a view that in this regard you can have at least two solutions. One is obvious to us. Security sciences are a scientific discipline, but you have to maintain a pretty significant, tough regime when it comes to treatment of this area of science as a scientific discipline, also owing to bureaucratic reasons, but also from the standpoint of the core of the scientific discipline. And also I support something that we should fight, inverted commas, to ensure that security sciences have a status of a scientific field. Although the term science is not clearly defined, because we can have axiological or a rational activity, but still we are in agreement, at least in this discussion which we are going to have today, that it's a structured resource of knowledge about human reality, about social, cultural reality, about developmental traits, and how you transform this into a number of justified statements. But please tell me that it will be treated in a complementary manner. Various standpoints that will be manifested today, you should say that this complementary approach, which may be treated as ensuring that it's a description, an explanation of reality, and also creating cognitively grounded attitudes to change the reality into one conducive to human being, not only theoretical pursuits, but also strong connection with social reality, cultural reality, and any other reality. The basic unit is scientific discipline, and whatever approach we use, owing to administrative treatment or from the standpoint of views of methodologists in that regard, a scientific worker, as Tadeusz Kotarbiński said, or Jedliński, or many other representatives who Borkowski, for example, the treatment of scientific disciplines is a part of knowledge, a field of knowledge, an area of knowledge, which one scientific worker can pretty effectively master with regard to didactics and creative pursuits. I won't be answering this question. I will only ask a question: whether when defense sciences are like a bag and you put everything into that, whether those sciences are such an area in which one person can colloquially manage, so understand the whole matter of this area of knowledge. Maybe I don't expect negations, but I'm not able to master everything that is happening in safety, security sciences. It's the effect of shaping of this activity. It's juxtaposition of many positions, views, and we come to some pretty clear definition, because in social sciences there is no uniform standpoint, and there is no one single right standpoint. There must be a paradigm which clearly defines a given object, and clearly defines studied reality, whoever deals with it. Formal subject, which I will apply later, and also the objective of studies. The reason being because the subject of studies, many scientific workers, but security sciences have their special nature in that regard. And not everybody who deals with this matter work with security sciences. Owing to likeness of scientific areas, we need to identify their singularity against other formal subject and objective and details. This is the job to be done. The double understanding of the subject of science, so the formal subject, material subject, means that we have to be aware that mainly the subject or formal subject decides as to which category, which discipline, scientific consequence we will include this area of science. And this is because if you treat the subject of studies, the various understandings, some people think it's just a subject. For me, I treat a subject as a superior notion, and would need objects, state of affairs, phenomena, circumstances, many objects that are the object of interest of the scientist. And the second part of the subject is characteristics, phenomena, states of affairs that describe the object of interest.
So this results in the fact that we have something similar. So it's not a material subject, I mean object of our interest. This could be the state, its functioning, its security, some social group, human being. Then we say about individual, personal security, group security, state security, international community security, but this will be also something the security is made of, I mean behavior, some normative elements that contribute to the existing state of things, and this is normal subject that's important from the point of view of both characteristic describing the subject of research, because this subject could be also some state of circumstances, and because of this, the status of the object being the subject of research, that's important. This aspect, this point of view at this reality that must be different from the formal subject of any other science. So briefly, it can be said that security of a state or national security or security of a group or a human being will be researched by legal expert, scientists, but one of them will be using this for this purpose, the history of creating the law and participation of the state entering into some areas where it intervenes with our everyday life. But this is not science on security. It's more about the law, about the legal standards. However, if we deal with security, taking legal standards as a tool for providing security to a social group, then this is the subject of the science on security, because I'm using this knowledge in interdisciplinary manner in order to ask the question, how should we provide security of a given entity or a given domain? And I believe that any domain, any scientific domain where we run interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary research, it doesn't rule out that still this is a scientific domain, but using some contributions of other sciences. And because of this, the science on security is just another type of science, but aimed at security. And because of this, ladies and gentlemen, I believe that science on security is a set of social sciences, including also components of humanistic, technique, and other sciences aimed at providing security and safe life and operation. I'm looking at Professor Ziemba because he's an authority from the Warsaw University, and they present the approach that it's very important to provide safe and secure development. So whatever is used to prevent any negative for security effect, that's very important. And we should touch the bullseye. I don't want to say about other things, but only 56 seconds was left for my speech, so science on security cannot be a science about everything. Some requirements and criteria must be met. I mean, the formal subject, goal of the research and research mission, and another approach that I support that's quite important in my opinion, that security sciences could be a separate scientific discipline, a group of disciplines separated in terms of the goal of using them, because we are looking for the answer, what should we do to be safe and secure? How should we provide this? We should also educate scientific personnel, and it's hard to imagine that every single person would be able to master this enormous knowledge, and we should include this in our education, higher educational system. And I'm a professor and I have this scientific title. However, I can tell you that I wouldn't even try to conduct some research within the legal sciences or political sciences or other scientific disciplines. So they are not interrelated disciplines. And as scientific domain, the security science should include theory of society. We should consider security of communities, and the methodology for scientific research is common for all sciences. And there is also a space for security theology by analyzing effect of worship of religion to security. And for the time being, we are not talking about defense, but probably military sciences should be brought back to the domain of sciences discipline, and some auxiliary, for example, economy sciences or administration for security. I'd like to leave it to you for further discussion. And I was told that my time has gone. I'd like to invite you for a conference on the 23rd and 24th of November about preparation of the state for external threat to its security. We reported this subject last year, and perhaps our neighbor from the eastern border took this as the, let's say, slogan for the European operations, and the current events on our eastern borders are providing good illustration how much important this is. This is nothing new. There are some regularities, and they are repeated from time to time. So this is an opportunity for a reflection on this. I'm sorry for prolonging my speech. Thank you very much. Now, I'd like to ask Professor Sulowski to present his views. First of all, I'd like to express my heartfelt thanks for invitation to this conference, ladies and gentlemen. I believe that this idea of this conference is very good, because let me remind you an episode just 10 years ago, right here, here at the Academy of National Defense. We had a meeting about status of military sciences, and at that time, for the first time, representatives of universities were invited, and we were discussing all this issue for a very long time and about the scope of security sciences. And then it was extended by the defense capability. I remember very subject matter discussions, especially I remember my talk with Professor Jacek Pawłowski, who was representing this university, and we were discussing. So it's like revisiting the roots. 10 years have gone, and we may again touch the same subject. I'd like to tell you about a few things related to social sciences. There are many interactions here, and not always we are aware of this. Let me touch just a few of them. The first of them is methodological consequences for security sciences. Another one are challenges for security sciences resulting from true controversial approach in social sciences that are, let's say, competitive. The interpretative threat and empiric threats, so in other words, a normative and neo-positivistic approach. And the third thing, if time allows, I'd like to present some demand, some methodological demand that's necessary for further positive development of security sciences. There are two important methodological consequences for security sciences. There are some limitations, methodological limitations. The subject of the research is always creating some methodological consequences. Andrzej Glenn said that security are people, devices, hardware, nature, and in the conceptual phase we have also people and a way of thinking. So it can be said that the subject of this research could be an object of analysis from all existing disciplines, and every science presents some specific subject of the research in terms of some specific issues. So one single subject of research could be also the subject of research for various disciplines. So it should be agreed that the subject of agreed for the security sciences is explored also by other disciplines, and there is no way to discuss about this. Unfortunately, in Polish scientific discussion about disciplines, we have some confusion, and Professor Filipowicz took a position that there are some natural domain of reality where some separate parts of the science find their own subject, and this is kind of a prejudice coming from positive tradition. And this is, let's say, abusing the objectiveness concept. And for me, in the security sciences, the subject of research is human being. And human being is a difficult subject for research. It should be noted that facts related to activity of human being in the area of security are depending on many conditions and are very diversified. It should be said that threats that are the subject of the security sciences results from activity of human being, but they are also of a natural character. And Professor Kamiński is right, because he says that some forms of society have a natural character. They could be seen as both an element of nature and the human nature. For example, eruption of the Vesuvio volcano is completely natural. However, the Pompeo city located on the slope of this volcano was made by human beings. And this is just the very point of the subject of the security sciences. It touches both the nature and culture. To sum it up, the specific, unique feature of the security sciences is combining nature with effects of human activity. Another limitation, methodological limitation, is related to research methods. It's always important to combine or link the method of research and the goal of research. In my opinion, the key is what specific knowledge is provided by the method and what knowledge is taken from the subject of the research. The method always structurizes some knowledge that we obtain, and also a multitude of methods used for research is important. Use of various methods provide various narratives, and security sciences must use all possible methods available to social sciences. It would be difficult to separate methods that are unique for security science only. And several can teach us everything about the nature, but not about the way of human behavior. And the fascination of statistical data led of some researchers to the position that they have found some cause and effect relation. And we may remind Mr. Walls, who said that figures are not so important for cause and effect relations. So the conclusion is that security sciences should use all possible methods available for social sciences. Another important consequence stemming from this is that what kind of approach should we use in our security sciences in face of such methodological limitations, and given the very complex nature of security, we have basically two approaches. Approach. But in general, this is the descriptive trend. Unfortunately, it's even worse, because very often this is a very eclectic descriptions, because we have a very extensive achievement for the last 10 years, and there are some very important papers that were created within this year. 10 years for any scientific discipline is not a long time. In my opinion, we cannot just skip this explanatory approach, and explanation based on scientific methods is very much desirable. However, when I support the empiric approach, I would suggest to be very cautious. Empirism cannot be characterized by means of some judgments of theories. In this thread of research, an administrator technician, statistician. They are completely new professionals competing today with more traditional type of professor, scientists, or a scholar. And this is associated with administrative creation. That's quite decisive to whether we got a grant or the scoring we obtain. Talking about the problems of security understood as effect of human behavior, suggestion of Leszek Nowak seems to be right. He said we should use the interpretative approach, and he says that the peculiarity of research on human behavior is interpretation. The interpretative approach is not just evasion of social sciences, but that's the right approach because it's used also within the technical sciences. And let me quote some nuclear science professor who said that his master, well-known nuclear physics professor, he said that characteristics for Professor Wilczyński is that together with experimental research, he was conducting very ambitious and very creative interpretative research. Ladies and gentlemen, facts are not speaking for themselves because facts are created by human beings in some specific historical and social environment, and they are always in agreement with some human adopted values. And we may refer to Friedrich Nietzsche, who said that the world is as it's that it's very difficult for generalization. Let me tell you that knowledge toolbox. This is general methodology. If we take into account not only the approach of researchers from many domains, humanistic and nuclear physics that I referred to, who don't refer to other methods, then it seems necessary to combine the interpretative and empiric approach, and this approach was supported by Professor Ziemba in one of his articles. He stated, referring to Max Weber, that most fruitful the methodology of research on security is the way suggested by Max Weber from interpreting and understanding to explanation.
We are left with 2 minutes for my presentation, so my project when it comes to putting forward a certain postulate will be in the second part. Maybe I will try to do it then. The idea is I wanted to present certain research proposal which results from reading of very famous and popular study by Charles Mills titled Sociological Imagination. This work helped me formulate a certain demand. Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Apart from us having a discussion, of course, there will be a possibility to put forward this for publication, for broader discussion of your arguments, and we'll try to publish it as soon as possible. Thank you very much. In that case, I would like to ask Professor Andrzej Glen to present his views on the matter. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much to the organizers for a possibility to share a number of reflections about our sciences. My intervention is titled Separative Nature of Security Sciences in the Social Science Area. It's a controversial title to a certain extent. It works fine, thank you. The title is a bit controversial, ladies and gentlemen, because we are all away from monodisciplinary sciences. Of course, I support my predecessors who are into transdisciplinary approaches. I share this approach fully, but ladies and gentlemen, perhaps at the end of the day, it is worth building the identity of security sciences. Mathematics has its boundaries, so we are not, so to speak, experienced when it comes to delineating the borders, which I would like to propose. In order to present some things, ladies and gentlemen, by way of introduction, I would like to show you in this table various ideas of understanding security. Please note that abstract security, the famous sinecura state, is an abstract name. We are changing it into concrete, into subjects, into space and time. And there may be different approaches. Of course, I marked 6 securities who they relate to, those entities. These are reference subjects of security. We know that Ryszard speaks of 3 units, individual, society, state. We have various numbers of entities and the names which can be discerned. But there are 10 subject securities. Professor Wróblewski speaks of 16. Perry Buchstan speaks of 5 sectors of security. So you have 2 approaches to space and time. It is future, past, and present. We have no other time in science. So is it science, space 1 or space 2? We have from up to 720 different contexts of understanding security of entities, because I'm of the opinion that in security sciences it does not stand in conflict with what I heard. We are dealing with the security of a subject. And how do we separate it out? I will discuss it later, but identify 3 main subject lines. So political security. Most of those humanists have philosophical background, which is significant. And I'm in the national security vein. I think that the systemic approach is good in this regard. And ladies and gentlemen, one comment. Let's look for inclusive. Let's treat it inclusively. Because we are such a small group of people, we had a fight to maintain discipline, that putting canons between those approaches is not conducive to the development of our discipline. In such circumstances, I would look for this separate nature. Why and how? How you saw it in the fundamentals, in axiological, epistemological, methodological. Why? Because in order to exceed borders, we need to delineate them. I'm of this opinion, and I will gladly discuss it. We cannot overthrow borders that we don't know, hence the title Separate Nature and Borders. We need borders so that in interdisciplinary approach, we know that from the standpoint of legal sciences, we are looking at the subject of our cognition placed in the security of the subject. I suggest adaptation, which I authored, Norman Daniels' method. He wrote about it a separate article, but this method relates to normative sciences. It's explained in a separate book. I wanted to adjust it a little, and I'm of the opinion that this separate nature, which I will demonstrate in a moment, should be defined by individuals evaluating appraisals. Let's consider the principles of the understanding, and this is the result of it. In the slide it is presented, and significant theories of background. I tried to, ladies and gentlemen, list the principal theories. They are the implication of good values. So if a person, the subject that values it, keeps with the rules that you see to the right, we have a chance to have rational evaluating judgment. So there are some principal values which create welfare of security. I know that Professor Ziemba will add, David Hume wrote in chapter 3 about morality in the treaty about human nature, that man feels happy when he has peace. I am of the opinion that it can be reduced to 4 values of welfare, so survival, integrity, independence and development. But please note what's the separate nature, what implies those values. The environment, which Professor Minkin mentioned, the environment of threats, the environment of threats as measure of those threats and uncertainty. I don't know any other discipline in the area of social sciences which, as a principal element of environment, has uncertainty and risk to that extent. And why do I treat it as a network? Because I treat it in a network way, because survival is an ability to live in security, and this is not possible without integrity, because it means resilience to distraction and to unauthorized changes. If changes are not to be authorized, we have to be independent of everybody and nothing. We have to have autonomy in making decisions and development. And from this, ladies and gentlemen, I state that in this context, which I mentioned, I see, looking at the time, I go further to our axiological distinctness. So ontologically, again, the threats and problems, because moments of existence of Roman Ingarden, we are not a primary entity. We are not dealing with it because primal entity is time absolute. Are we independent? No, we are not. We coexist with other entities. Are we, therefore, an entity which is independent? No. If ontologically we look at this subject as an entity that is independent of threats and challenges, will be creating utopian theories. In my opinion, the context of challenges and threats is necessary to have intermediate utilitarian nature of research. Ladies and gentlemen, here a bit different standpoint, but we have to beautifully be different. Professor Żurowski idealistically approaches the interpretative reality. I'm more of a realist. I suggest that security of a subject is defined against dualism, realism. Why dualism? Why dependent? We have only 5 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, I used two spheres, real and conceptual. It was already mentioned in literature, but I modified it slightly, and you can see 3 worlds, also slightly modified. Evolutionary epistemological theory and the physical world is the first word in the real sphere. We have concrete objects in physical, spatial terms. You can discuss it, of course. It's also increased, but dualism is not that. Dualism for me, because there is a real sphere, and dualism because the real sphere depends on conceptual sphere and vice versa. Professor Żurowski mentioned this methodology. And ladies and gentlemen, the second world of Popper is untouched. It's the consciousness, experience of our consciousness, and there where our intellect lies. Understanding and reasoning. Popper proposes objective knowledge, but because he reads about hypotheses. So you have objectivized knowledge, subjective knowledge, but objectively holding truth. And why do we need it? In order for our conscience, this was mentioned by Professor Solewski, that we have to, when describing the world, we have to use scientific facts. We have to take them from somewhere. We take them from objectivized knowledge. Part of the knowledge, yes, we have it in our conscience, but our brains have a limited capacity, and then we go to the objectivized knowledge base, objectivizing the raw facts. And then dualistic dependence realism, I suggest it as a way of looking at the subject from the ontological standpoint. This universe is including many things because there are various conflicting outlooks. You could say a lot of things, but I have time limits with me. But epistemologically, as Professor Stanisław Szumowski mentioned, we are not dealing with men separately. I'm speaking of truth and sources of truth and methods of reaching truth and limits of learning the truth. This is what epistemology does. We are not dealing with a human being separately. This is a job for medical people, for psychologists, for people from management science, but also mechanism. We are dealing with the system of 3 resources connected with complementary relationships. Of course, the person as a tool uses artifacts of security. This was mentioned by my rector professor. Those tools are sometimes immaterial, not material. But please note that I don't know any other discipline in social sciences area, but I will gladly hear it. Which discipline, apart from security sciences, localizes the subject of cognition so strongly in the environment of challenges and threats? I'm left with 2 minutes, so I go further. Ladies and gentlemen, it's the last illustration which I proposed. I presented, it was well received by Professor Sułowski from the University of Warsaw and Venice. And also we had Professor Czaputowicz who spoke of multidisciplinarity. I spoke of complementary paradigm. I speak of that inclusivity. First of all, you can see, my point is not working as I expected. The objectivized knowledge is the third world of Karl Popper. That's where you have the notions, the sentences we then use, creating scientific facts, and here this interpretativist about raw facts. And here again, I would look for certain separatedness, because this paradigm mixes a number of approaches, and with a system approach, the systems help us process the facts, and The approach, conceptual approach, is very creative, productive, but hardly operational. But together, the three cognitive strategies give you a chance for big progress in cognition. And now methodologically, I know that I'm out of time, but it's not my slide. My teacher, Mieczysław Pelc, once member of the Methodological Committee of the Polish Academy of Sciences, pointed attention to something. We have no access to object of condition. We take over criteria function of reality. This makes us distinct, clearly. This makes us clearer, owing to what facts and challenges, and we are not dealing with methodology of processing matter. I think we are dealing with methodology of processing information. This is the encyclopedia outline. That's where our methodology is seen, in combining basic sciences with applied sciences. Probably there is a majority of applied sciences, and a summary, because I'm of time. We are looking at it right now. I won't be reading it out. The main message, I think, I managed to convey. Thank you for standing back to you, but I'm blinded by the lights.
Thank you very much. Well, these headlines are perhaps not very pleasant, but let's recall what happens to celebrate who are always in the limelight. Now I'd like to ask Mr. Ginia to present his views. Like during an interview, it was created by the Minister of Science. And because the environment was willing, this discipline is functioning. What's the subject of the research within this discipline? In my opinion, it's security as an existential need of both communities and individuals, social groups, nations, the whole mankind. This could be security of the state as an institution or organization of social life, or security of a group of states, regional security, or some international systems. That's about international security. What's the nature of security? Long years ago, I used to work in the Academy of National Defense, and at that time we were disputing within the team of professors. Some of them are present today. I always presented the view that the essence of security is certainty of entities, certainty that they will survive, that they will live, that they will be healthy, and also the freedom of behavior, and also the certainty of functioning and development. I'm highlighting this because there are many publications. Unfortunately, I'm not very happy about them, and they say that security is equal to lack of threat. That's not true. That's not sufficient. It doesn't meet the criteria for scientific analysis. How can we define security? In my opinion, I wrote a lot of things, so I'd like to refer to what I've written before. In my understanding, security can be stated as a certainty of survival, functioning, and development of various entities. This certainty is not always resulting from lack of threat, but also it's created because of creative, sometimes preventive actions of entities. It's changing in time and has the nature of a social process. Professor SZPYRA asked another question. What are detailed scientific categories occurring in the security sciences? Let me start in a more controversial manner from human security. The Canadians from Quebec said security la humaine, it's security of an individual, the national, international security. There could be also military, raw materials related security. There are disputes, and this list will never be closed. A very important questions from Professor SZPYRA was, what are the functions of security sciences? My answer could be disappointing, just like for other sciences, cognitive and beyond cognition. This is cognitive includes first of all the descriptive and explanatory missions, and beyond scientific functions is the pragmatic. It's about application of security science. Quite often they are used in political practice of any country. This could be also an ideological function to justify some non-scientific systems based on authority of science. What are the methods of security research? Nothing original. These are the same methods that are used in other social sciences. This could be empiric, theoretical research, and this could be analysis of the wording of documents, cognitive method, and this is not so important. However, much more important is the question about types of methodologies of security research. Let me revisit what I've written some time ago when I was working for this academy. It's about the scientific explanation of the work that's included in the basic sciences. This is a positivistic threat, and another approach is explanatory one that was created much later in the 17th century. It's like writing the history from inside. This approach was developed in France. So what research methodology should be selected? There are many options. I prefer two basic options. As it is known, a very fruitful methodology is the one that shows, following Max Weber, away from interpreting a phenomenon up to its explanation. The closest variant to this method is moderate constructivism that is reflected in works of Alexander Venta. This is kind of a golden middle. However, in recent years, roughly from the end of the first decade on the 21st century, when we see very dangerous events in international arena, and we have a kind of renewal of realistic approaches, something emerged that was wrongly named neoclassical realism, and Ripsman and other researchers research into the security starting from external context. In case of state security, this will be international context, and also internal preferences research. What comes out from the state, what's changing, what can be measured. We see that we may refer to sociology, to well-known papers from the 70s, for example, by Antoniego, who wrote that it's very important to understand the threats Poland, when we read its publicist papers and politicians, we may see that they fail to understand what's the nature of security, and all the time they are trying to press such an interpretation of this term that has nothing in common with science. It's rather pure marketing or political efforts. So one may say that methods of security research coming from basic sciences, I mean empiric, positivistic methods, are undergoing some renaissance, but from the end of the 80s of previous century, we see more and more post-positivist approaches focusing on subjective, conscious-related issues, and we see what's the difference, what's within the subject, what's outside. So what's within a state and what's in the international system. Maybe it's not clear enough, but I will try to answer now the most difficult question asked by Professor SZPYRA. What are the basic statements of security sciences? Based on what I read, I believe that first, such a statement is that security is existential value of various entities. Secondly, security is researched mainly in a negative context as a state of threat, of counteracting a threat. Another statement is that security has very broadly described external aspect, but also internal aspect that's not always overestimated. And security is also how entity approaches to some opportunities and challenges, and the perception of challenges themselves could be part of the security. Another statement of Polish science of security is that strengthening of security by various entities cannot be limited to elimination of threats, but it should also cover preventive actions, increasing the resistance of the entity to future threats that are not known at a given moment. And the last statement is that security should be seen in three domains. The entity-related one, when we say who's depending on this security, subjective, and then in the functional or processual domain, when we check how this security is changing in time, how it functions. And Professor SZPYRA asked, what are the theories in security sciences? I would say that there are no specific theories related to security. However, there were some publications on that. Researchers writing about security are using some basic paradigms and theories that exist in other social sciences. Most often, this is realism, neorealism, and so-called structural neorealism that could be offensive, defensive, and the neoclassical neorealism that's recently quite a buzzword. And we may say that Hans Morgenthau, the classic of the realism, Kenneth Wolff, neorealist, name a representative of the structural realism, John Marsheimer, very fashionable recently, who justify expansionism of big powers, or Chas Glazer, who said that big powers are acting very realistically because the powers are always realistic in making their decision to start a war. And finally, a very fashionable theory is liberalism and various kinds of neoliberalism. For example, the theory of democratic peace or a couple other terms. And finally, social constructivism based on papers wrote by Alexander Wendt, but not always. Constructivists highlight the fact that language used by politicians and used by researchers is very important, because language reflects something that constructs our vision of security. Friedrich Kratochwil, the German professor from München, many years ago was writing about this. And even if we analyze what was said by politicians of any European countries, we may see that their language, their way of speaking about security is very specific. It imposes some specific understanding. What else? There are also some critical theories, for example, that of Cox and Windretter. Critical theories try to identify interest, to explain what interests are behind some interest or actions for security. And more fashionable is modernism, presented by Walker, Darren, Klein, or Campbell. People who treat everything as a form of awareness. They said that there is no objective reality, only what's reflected by our awareness exists. And also feminism is a buzzword. Perhaps you will be surprised that I'm mentioning this, but there are many very interesting papers, and including Polish researchers, and it's not easy in Poland. And the last phrase, what are the theories? Theories are kind of lenses that are used by us to analyze the phenomenon of security. So we look through these lenses, and depending on their nature, we see something in black or rosy light. And results of security research could be different depending on theory applied. Which of them are better? It's up to individual assessment. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor. And in the end, I'd like to present my paper. Could you please display my presentation? Professor Andrzej, where's the flipper? Ladies and gentlemen, I will allow myself to present a subjective perception of creating basic terms, and I will present several conclusions because my time is limited. And my full paper will be included in the conference papers. Recently, we observe more and more publications about security. However, many of them refers to national security or state security. They are not much related to general theory of security. However, there is a general category of security referring to all entities of considerations. We may also try to identify questions about explained by three basic philosophies of this materialistic being, and considerations of many authors lead us to the conclusions that in the living nature, one of general features is this trend to extend life. We see this in the kingdom of vegetables, animals, and people. This is directly related to existence of real beings as seen from real perspective. And human being is the only entity changing the environment it can consider, knowing all possible kind of security. Given the fact that security as a social construct refers first of all to the nature and human being, we may assume that security is an abstractive category of human thinking, defining possibility of lasting for real beings and improvement of being of those beings. If we ask which of these beings is able to shape actively the environment, it's out of any doubt it's human being. Security as a general category can refer to all possible living and non-living nature. And for example, the existence of the ice caps in Arctic is very important. So we see that this is quite unlimited area of research for many science disciplines. However, security in social look to security as considered on the ground of social sciences. However, taking into account the universal nature of security, we will be able to identify the area of research. What are the social sciences according to encyclopedia? These are sciences dealing with social processes as observed from various perspectives. Based on this and other definitions, we may assume that social sciences are dealing with interhuman relations, and the area of this research focuses on social processes concentrated around human being. This limitation constitutes also the area of research on security and disciplines, and also
from security in social sciences. Security may be researched upon by various disciplines in individual fields through many theoretical and methodological concepts. In very modern, complicated world, a multidisciplinary approach covering holistic understanding, researchers into security treat security as significant value for the human being. You should, however, ask what is original as the value. So ask about values or value autodelic value. He knows that he's the life that wants to continue. He knows that other beings have the will to live. Through discovering the sense of life, the man confirms his will to live. As mentioned by Krzysztof Drabik, a man as a subject is a superior element of the categoric imperative. Exemplification of this imperative is the understanding that the human being is the objective in himself, but when looking for autotelistic values, you should remember about distinctness of cultural and understanding of this value. The dominant orientation characteristic of modern philosophy is anthropocentrism. According to Ryszard SZPYRA, a non-critical anthropocentrical approach would be unjustified, but we clearly see the negative consequence, but they did not have an impact on the state of affairs. Ryszard SZPYRA, as we know, we have no doubt we live in the world which, independently of the cultural science, we have one dominant ideology of anthropocentrism. In anthropocentrism, you have various civilizational approaches. In the civilization of the West, we have anthropocentrism considering the human being as the center of whole reality. Which existentialism which accepts this as the man as the only entity has direct impact on what he does, and by making independent choices he expresses his freedom. A different approach in the West, in the Orient, in Chinese culture, where you have Confucianism, the interest of community is above the interest of an individual. In Asian countries, in the East, the collective is of utmost importance, and this means that the significant difference is that the civilization of the West, that for values of the civilization of the West, you have existence of the human being, but other civilizations, mainly of the Orient, assume that the value is group or human collective. Independently of that, without the individual, you wouldn't have a group. So in reality, there is no such big difference. And from the standpoint of social scientists, autototalitic value is the existence of a human being as an individual, and also of a group, a collection of individuals. From this, we can infer that both for social sciences and security sciences, the autototalic value will be static human being and his collections, and in dynamic meaning existence of the human being and his collective. Security in various understandings and perspectives can have different meanings. The best illustration is by Cezary Rutkowski, who says that security can be reviewed as the state, situation, ability, possibility, object, process, system, condition, collection, object, function, feeling, interest, result, and other similar categories. However, on the basis of thinking to date, security is such a category which is connected with some autototalic value, and it's lasting. That's why we'll accept that the meaning core in social sciences, the abstract category of human thinking, which delineates objective possibilities of real entities in human society and his environment, so mainly men, and or his collective, and strive to improve the possibility for those entities to last. And the question then arises, when security exists, what is its final criterion? In the context is an objectively existing reality, so existence of a human being or a collective, but it is a posteriori criterion. Can we therefore discern a priori meaning of security? Of course, yes. Nevertheless, we are not able to define exactly. We may only estimate this meaning. The milieu in which we have immersed the life, you have a phenomenon which is dialective, opposite of security, which is insecurity, and they disable existence of a subject, of a human being, and or his community. The next notion is subject and object. You could think that there should not be any controversies, but in literature we see many approaches. Here we can see the overview of the approaches, and depending on the author, sometimes there is a different naming convention of a given category, either as subjective or as objective, and so on. In order to be precise, you have to ask yourself a question about what we are talking. So whose security is at stake, or who provides for security, or in what area? But then sometimes a different person or organization provides for security, and then the entity is not a subject of security, independent of possibilities of a human being. When it comes only to an answer about whose security we are talking about, it's the subjective aspect. In this aspect, also a person can be an object of review, but the conclusion may lead us to believe that entities created by a human being will be objective of security, and his community, and existence of objects created by him. But the notion of a subject is a manifestation of an ability of a human being to act in order to survive. Jerzy Konieczny thinks that the subject of security can be an object having some resource, hierarchy of values, and the subject is exert a factual outcome on environment. But this activity should be intentional and change the situation whereby a specific section of social world is changed. This means that the subject is such an entity which provides for security. How Cezary Rutkowski formulates security by whom is organized and shaped, and who is responsible for this state and process. So in other words, we can assume that depending on what approach we understand to it, but if we use some subject, we need to exactly know what we mean. Whether speaking of a subject, we speak of whose entity, whose security is at stake, or we ask who is providing for security. The man is an object of security, but is not a subject because parents provide for security. But the man can only be an objective of security and at the same time a subject, because he can provide for his own security, but the security of a human being is provided for by the state in some way. Undoubtedly, in that setup, in most general sense, a person, apart from being object of security, is the main subject of the security. His existence is the main value, but the man is the only conscious element of nature, but he can actively change his natural environment. That's why the man is the main subject of conscious shaping of his or her security. And finally, a conclusion which will be followed later during the discussion or in studies. It's difficult to imagine a different form of shaping security than some human activity, so some activity spread over time. And here you can conclude this study. Thank you very much. It's only somehow a very introductory part to further deliberations. Why is it important? Because frequently, maybe a short example, security of information. Frequently we say that what is the social sciences, social information security is the security of a human being in the context of his information needs. And only later, as the third aspect is information security, system security, etc. Thank you very much. And now a half an hour break, after which we will reconvene here and we'll continue a discussion. People will be able to ask questions, etc. So let's assume that we reconvene at 11:30 according to my watch. Thank you very much. You are more than welcome to rejoin us after the break.
Na wstępie od tego, aby zapytać,
from not only humans, we deal also with security of ice caps
lodowców,
and
czap lodowych, tak.
glaciers.
I w związku z tym
And because of this,
jeszcze jest druga część tego pytania, która
there is
jakby
one
się z
more
nią zapewne
question.
łączy. Mowa była przy tym drzewie, dosyć graficznie fajnie wyglądało. Bezpieczeństwo innych bytów realnych wspierających człowieka. Jakbym mógł prosić o bliższe określenie, bo ja stoję na stanowisku raczej, że tam, gdzie nie ma człowieka, nie ma problemu bezpieczeństwa. Na Jowiszu dzieją się takie rzeczy, że my byśmy w ogóle tam nie byli nigdy bezpieczni. Byśmy się tam znaleźli, ale tam nie ma problemu bezpieczeństwa, bo Jowisz, przyroda nieożywiona, no to tam, gdzie nie ma człowieka, to nikt nie postrzega niczego przez pryzmat myślenia o bezpieczeństwie. Więc nie wiem, co z tymi czapami, jeżeli mamy na uwadze człowieka, który bierzemy pod uwagę fakt istnienia tego typu zjawisk naturalnych, które oddziałują na życie, bezpieczne funkcjonowanie człowieka, poczucie bezpieczeństwa.
Of course, this is the climate-related issue,
o same zdarzenia, stany rzeczy.
but there are some phenomena resulting in the fact that we are free of threats or not. So if somebody deals with security of ice caps, or is this seen through the lens of human security? Professor, could you please elaborate on this? Yes, I will start from the second aspect, and I couldn't agree more. In the dinosaur era, there was no security because there was no human beings. So no matter what they were doing, there was no security or lack of security at that time. Now, referring to the first subject you touched, perhaps other science disciplines, not only the social ones, may take into account aspects of security. Perhaps some life sciences may consider other issues, for example, climate-related ones. We wouldn't like this climate to change, but we know from the history it's been changing all the time, and only from human point of view we may say whether these changes were good or bad. I only suggested in the beginning that other science disciplines may deal with security, but without getting deeper into this, talking about social sciences, the main entity for taking into account, first of all, the human being. So this simple example I used, information security. If we talk about social rather than technical sciences, we should put the human measure to this, and for survival of humans, what kind of information is needed. And one of professors mentioned autonomy, sovereignty, and social cybernetic scientists said that an individual is, let's say, sovereign only if it controls what it consumes. So if we are not able to control what we eat, we can get poisons. So if we are not able to evaluate information, to what extent the information, but we take into account the energy security, information security. In the very beginning of all these things is an individual or a group of individuals. And a derivative of this is information or IT security. So there is some hierarchy of values. So we may say in technical sciences that the main subject is information itself, or we need awareness that we are within a science, social science discipline, and there are we cannot just take this subject as a completely separate thing. Special services is just one of the part of this subject, and so on. Whatever is specific may be highlighted. However, I would suggest that we should talk about further development after getting to know better with our environment, instead of looking at disciplines, psychology, history, or even basic sciences. Everybody begins thinking what we need imagination for in terms of continuation of our research. And in several recent historical papers, and this convinces me that security science, in order to continue its development, requires this security-related imagination. I would believe that this imagination is an intellectual feature allowing us to interpret correctly threats and new forms of behavior in the face of a danger to maintain security. This refers to both the pandemic and terrorism, and security imagination allows us to understand that we live in the age of risk, as was mentioned by Ulrich Beck, and many things were related to security, and today they are even more important. The security-related imagination allows us to understand that security refers to everything. Some people believe that it was something what was done with Carl Schmitt with politics. It refers to activity of humans, both in terms of teamwork and also in technical area. For example, in politics, the role of a human being is very important. Threats may come from the very nature of a human being, so even properly functioning political institutions can be a source of threat if a political leader has some authoritarian, let's say, inclination. Thomas Hobbes predicted this before, and not all threats are resulting from development of economy and technology. So I would suggest that the reductionist approach, placing reasons of phenomena at the level of individuals, and systemic approach where we take into account many elements from many systems. In material and technical issues, there could be some spontaneous threats, they could depend not only from behavior of human being, but rather from the very nature of humans. For example, the current pandemic requires from our researchers to take into account the legal context, I mean the limitation of the civil rights, psychological context, and also technical, medical, political context, and so on. The manipulation itself with the data related to pandemic forces us to think how the issue related to pandemic should be managed, and the government should think over new competences needed for this. And security-related imagination is also useful for adjusting the toolbox we use to the subject of our research. We should be cautious because mutual relations of method and theories result also in some limitations. I would send you to the famous paper by Paul Aberabend, who wrote a big paper against the method, and he's very critical about a kind of a rigorism in terms of application of methods, and many other recommendations like that could be presented to obtain a chance to continue our research. But let me repeat it again. Further development of the science on security within social sciences requires getting to know and integration within the nearest other disciplines of science about administration, politics, law. And I believe that we can only adapt to this to avoid being treated as something completely separate, completely new. Thank you very much. Well, talking about some scope of meaning, and we connote, and then we have some properties of the discipline. So if there is a scope, there are some. We may use this term specifics. What are the properties of this term? And well, I haven't conducted any etymological research on this name, but it's more about some attributes. What they do, to some extent, they describe the quality, what we are doing through the scientific cognition, and we assign some meaning to this. In logics, we say about constitutive and consecutive features. It was Socrates who used this definition, and these Socratian tables could be useful today to determine what's constitutive and what consecutive feature that describe a given name, because in this interpretivism we talk about names.
Realism, because we have to name the reality somehow. That's how I would see that. And I have one comment I would like to share with you aloud. The trends to hypothesize. We should really avoid it. This is my standpoint, because hypostasing, as Kotarbiński wrote, I read it in the Theory of Cognition, in one of the works that I have, and hypostasing is assigning human features to abstracts. We say that abstract delineates something. The man using this abstract specifies something. The abstract does not do anything. I checked it somehow. When students says that Constitution says, I have the Constitution on my desk. Constitution says something, and it stayed silent. Authors of the Constitution, state of security in secura, This is the abstract. It has to be defined by way of subject. Who does it relate to? It may be the object of security, who creates the security. So there is the subject of security. When we say security of a subject, we say who does the security relate to. When you see the subject of security sciences, we say what we do in the security sciences. I will come back to those procedures and to their borders and to the specifics. I'm speaking of the facts now and not my own. In our scientific discipline, it is quite common for reviewers to be reviewers from outside our discipline, because we don't have that status. I haven't heard, I haven't seen, no one asked me. I think that no professor here was asked. I haven't heard that someone asked any of us to the procedure of checking the PhD in psychology. I haven't heard that someone named us to be a promoter of a historical dissertation. And now in our discipline it is possible. I haven't heard that someone nominated me to be a reviewer about management sciences. And in our department there was a procedure which a guy from section, yes, inclusively, between us in all the threads we represent, but we should guard our discipline and fend away the attempts when people decide who is to be the future teacher of next generations, the master of pupils in the security sciences. And I'm sorry, but you can see my emotions rise because it sometimes forces me to write. No one wants to write a negative review, but sometimes you have to, because that's the way things go. You add something about science, security precisely, like truth, like information. The science could not precisely delineate borders of those. And that's why sometimes we have to live with a conviction that there is a certain area, but it is difficult for it to have precise boundaries. But as you said, Professor, I agree with that. The idea is that the researcher who studies comes from basic assumptions of security sciences using various methodologies or achievements of other sciences, and they have to be aware in the research process and description of his studies. Professor Minkina, please, wanted to take the floor. The floor is yours. Ladies and gentlemen, in our debate, there appeared two ideas: to unite knowledge, but also looking for identity of our security sciences. And at the university I represent, there are 6 areas and over 20 scientific disciplines where scientific research is carried out. We frequently discuss about methodological issues, and I have to somehow integrate the milieu, and there is a question asked sometimes what the idea is in the science, and we are concerned with looking for truth, for reaching to the truth. And as I noticed, in many disciplines, theoretical or empirical, they have their own truths. And my question is, where is the truth in our case, in security sciences? Since we are looking for identity, we have to have our own truth. Do we have such a truth? And another question, challenge in our security sciences, we are a theoretical science, but aren't we aspiring to be an applied science so that our thoughts, our discoveries are implemented in the security systems? And now a question, whether security institutions that are responsible for it, do they use our achievements, theoretical achievements, our thoughts, our suggestions, our conclusions? Thank you. Thank you. Before I hand over to the next speaker, I came back to the starting point trying to answer the question, what in social sciences is wrong that they develop outside reality? No discipline in social sciences will develop correctly when it does not serve the reality. And he claims these sciences are limited to the description and to what extent to explanation, to what extent to forecasting and identifying with competent counsel, as professors see it. Maybe some short evaluations about it. Does anyone feel a need to share his thoughts with us? I think that it is so that if I were to, for example, to study the state of criminal threats in some voivodeship, I would do empirical research, 1,000 survey pollers. I would describe it according to some criteria. I would adopt a theory, I would conduct research, but for other social sciences in our field, I would be totally, because it would be empirical data, but if I wrote about this threat, take into account some paradigm, I would explore history. I would show that in previous years and systems, there was some source of criminal threats, etc. I would write it separately, and they would say, this is just a tale. And this, of course, is a study. No, of course not. I have an impression, that's why my demand is to include the two approaches, an explanatory one based on empirical research, and the interpretational one, understanding the questions we have. It always has to be enriching our knowledge, but we'll never reach some truth with regard to exact sciences that, let's say, you throw a stone and it has some specific velocity and it can be empirically corrected. But if we think that you come, let's say, to the bank at night and no one mugs me and takes away, please use the microphone, and someone takes the wallet, I say it's a bad state because there is no police, I was not defended. And it's a question of interpretation. One case, yes, it cannot prove that the state is working badly. And that's why my proposal is that we try and combine various approaches. They conflict with other sciences like politology, sociology. Sociologists contend with interpretators and with those who are empirists, who only produce surveys. We know what negative aspects of empirical research are. I don't want to discuss them because I think that sometimes you can suggest a lot when giving answers. So I think that this is, of course, the demand to integrate various approaches, and I think this should well serve social security sciences. I was concerned with this because professor is at the stage of explaining, but I'm concerned with whether we scientists should be satisfied only with explanations or also describe the consequences of this explanation. And this would be the serving role for practitioners, that we explain something and we only leave it for you. You can read it and you will find yourselves what the consequences can be, whether we should explain the phenomenon and additionally write that the consequence of this phenomenon is such and such. The idea is only because I don't know whether sometimes it's a question that will be discussed in a moment, whether encroaching on the area of core sciences, maybe Professor Kepler would like to have some willingness to say something. I will only say we are pondering over the borderlines of security sciences. I'm not trying to summarize this discussion, but I can see that we are striving to achieve it from other paradigms. We try to, from the standpoint of sciences that we best performed, but the idea is always the same. I would say quite paradoxically, how a PhD subject will perform who will not get a promotion. Will he go to an administrative court and seek redress his rights? No, because he's not a specialist in security sciences. And will he refute? Will the advocate refute in front of the court the professor of who issued a negative review, or although the sciences are akin, and the competencies of reviewers, yes, but the procedure is naming a wrong person to issue a review. That's why they can expect that a person with recognized achievements will be issuing an opinion about his achievements towards a PhD. I'm not discussing things in detail because you will need to rely on experience in that matter. But I will say as follows. I'm not myself negating the fact that from the standpoint of various sciences, you can deal with security. I will reiterate once again that a sociologist can talk about security, or a historian, and there are persons in that room that grew from such sciences and but there are also lawyers, but there are also theologists. We have one theologist in this university. He works at the University of Warsaw. We know about Professor Cezary and what is happening. He also got, and is he in the room? No.
So he's a theologist, however, he deals with the security sciences. I was tracking with discussion of the several people, and truth should be proven. And one example in these examples shows that the state is properly built, and we should use arguments from various sources to give a proof that it may happen such and such in many cases when similar circumstances occur. And the consequences of several people struggling with the problem of migration from the historian way of thinking to the way of thinking, arguments that proving that if you are not properly protected, you will not be able to defend yourself. This is already a security science, but it doesn't mean that we don't draw from experience of other science discipline. If I wouldn't have my existing knowledge about the law, about administration. I wouldn't be able to deal with security, theory of the state, theory of the law, and all this must be known, not to deal with some legal hypothesis, but to search what the state has done by establishing the law and the normative system to provide security to us. This is one of the goals of existing a state. Ziemba and Bobrov mentioned this in the international security, in the book on international security. There are also some normative measures. And to cut the long story short, one more thing, sources, for example, newspapers from other countries, but also some other documents. And in consequence, we provide to practitioners some receipts, some formulas, but not formulas telling them how to behave, but rather formulas in terms of solutions that present to the practitioners some behavior patterns and some solutions of the state to provide security, starting from an individual up to international environment. That's needed because otherwise our scientific activity would be useless. And I believe that this practical part, not empirical, more pragmatic part of our science efforts should be aimed at its application. We have the National Center of Research and Development. They fund nanotechnology, drug activity, and that's our task to track this, to interpret it, and to explain this. But in the same time, we should give some guidelines for the future. And what Professor SZPYRA suggested in relation to the strategic culture, what I mean is that we reach out for experiences of the science. It's not because the minister decided to do so. We are just, let's say, within a heritage of the experience of military sciences, but also sciences on international relations. And because of this, today, this science discipline in its existing shape. Mr. Chairman, can I? I don't know whether professors who didn't speak so far, maybe they would like to speak. Mr. Chairman, well, I give up my opinion because we need to discuss with the audience from the floor. So let's give a chance to people from the floor. You're right, sir. And I announced they will be answering questions from the floor. Is there anybody willing to ask a question or present a comment among the audience, or to ask about something or present some comment? General, please approach the microphone. Because there are nobody else willing to ask a question, let me take this risk and tell you that that's true. Stars, let's say, blinding us. I have a question to the panelists because I have a PhD title and I'm a graduate, but I'm also a consummate practitioner. And science on security affected perception of react on humans, on our activity and our behavior will be growing. And in general, my impression is that practice is going a step before the security science, and the security science are trying to follow it. And what about this artificial intelligence? To what degree this science is progressive? Thank you very much, sir. Well, in terms who would you like to answer your question? All the panelists? I have one reflection to what you were talking about, the effect of practice on theory in American scientific practice. Beyond cognitive values are effective, the science to a bigger and bigger extent. Mrs. Cortich, one of American scientists, is against using beyond cognition values in science, but still practice is finding its way to science. And on the other hand, ideology, post-truth, begins to affect the scientific community. To what extent? This is a question. Does the ideology, the concept of post-truth, shape the truth we see? In what direction American and Western universities go? Was this born on scientific foundations or ideological foundations? These are interesting questions. Now, talking about artificial intelligence, still there is a main question in terms of the science on security. How development of artificial intelligence may affect the development of the mankind, the state, institutions of culture? Will it be a threat? Will it help? So this main question remains still to be answered, but we need to climb the higher and higher level of knowledge to learn exactly what is artificial intelligence, because we need to learn about new and new phenomena, at least confrontation in the domain of culture. That's important even for national security, because we need to get to know with various other cultures and ideas, because they could be a threat to our national security, and because of this we should extend our penetration. General Sławek, we've been working together in the past as the theoreticians, but this is a natural thing that practice drives science. The reality fulfills a motoric functions in terms of science, and there is a criterial and final function shown on the slide. Science begins and ends on facts. This was mentioned by Albert Einstein, and a philosopher, Kobeni, presented a simple drawing induction. Everything begins with facts and ends up with fact. That's out of any discussion, and we should now differentiate the fact of practice driving the science is commonly known. It's well described by various specialists Jose Ortega Gasset mentioned the feeling of being lost felt by a human being, and this feeling of being lost is when we come to a wall and we hit a wall and we start to create new skills and new knowledge. Aristotle mentioned about the knot, that a human being encounter a knot, and to know how to untie this knot, some knowledge is necessary. So that's it in terms of relations of practice with theory. If I may, I'd like to tell just a few words. This link between practice and theory is needed to some extent, and it's desirable. But however, it seems to me that recently it's becoming too much vulgar, because it leads to marketization of developed new ideas, and they change the word. So it's the strength of related with general. Just advocacy. You touch the problem of relations between knowledge and practice. This is in the same time the way of thinking that has two ends, because we know that intelligence, information is a specific kind of knowledge. I mentioned this before, so it has a lot in common with science. So first, history shows that both military commanders and politicians didn't use this knowledge, but they were following their beliefs, their ideas, and they believed that the whole state would respond in the same way as a given commander. So knowledge was not taken into account in the decision-making process. However, the other side of these relations, history shows that institutions that were providing knowledge, in this case media, very often were wrong, and this led to disastrous results. So the conclusion is that we must not create very stiff relations. We should we should stick to the common sense. Very briefly, ladies and gentlemen, General Sławomir, relations between the theory and practice are of double nature. On one hand, as the professor said, the demand on practitioners very often leads the science. I mean, the person who hasn't seen the word sociological human nature in other dimensions. Putting of bold hypothesis is good only if we know the subject matter well. If we lock the idea creator in a dark room and he wouldn't know the word at all, his idea would come to the end, because his best idea would be how to get out of this dark room. And Professor, probably you understand what I'm trying to tell you, but this is not just a pure controversy. And because of this, we need to know exactly. I will refer to my doctoral thesis. Due to the fact that I reached back to the historical experience, back to the Chinese big wall and walls that are built by the Chinese. And my strategic problem was the strategic cover for a state. What happened recently on our eastern border, I reached again to my doctoral thesis, and everything was already predicted and written. I was just reaching out to historical experiences. That's the example. I'm just using the historical reflections, historical experience.
This was constructed on the basis of knowledge, how world goes on. I have no big aspirations that I have such big knowledge, but the idea is the very fact of events that happen between states about conflicts which leads to conflicts. Small differences, what happens in the eastern border, and practitioners exercise that. I hope some people used it, that they were at senior simulations, how complicated are connections between states and what measures should be taken and how you should fight dangerous situations. The threats are important because awareness of threats and challenges in that aspect gives us a possibility to create necessary precautions. Thank you. One extra word, may I? I would also like to indicate the aspect that frequently we have the knowledge just behind us, but we ignore the fact that we have that knowledge. We have no imagination that the knowledge we have will have specific consequences. Because if we paid attention to the words of Junior Lieutenant Vladimir Putin, what he said in 2008 in Bucharest at NATO summit, that if Ukraine is pro-Western, but it will be so, but without Donbas and Crimea. This knowledge was commonly known, but there were no consequences taken from that knowledge. And in 2014, things happened that happened. Thank you, Professor. Does it work? Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, I didn't speak because the discussion is very theoretical, but in the recent statements, there is a reference to the fact that science, security science, should be good sciences. It should be good knowledge, when knowledge is good, not when it is subject to fashion and fads, when that great superpowers behave always in the same way. US behaved similarly and Soviet Union behaved similarly during Cold War. This caused uproar among liberals. Now, big democracy and communist Soviet Union. No, analyze the behavior. You have to analyze exactly, and then you will infer the right conclusions. You should analyze the facts, but some people will say that realists, that they concentrate on the facts. Frequently they write about armaments in Poland. For example, in Poland we read that Russia is arming itself, but we rarely read that this is 1/10 of what America spends on armaments. So one is dangerous to security, one is not. So realists and researchers who write to meet politicians' expectations, they are news that intelligence provides, and then we'll know what the intentions are. So we can see on two examples that both the realistic approach, on one hand it gives us something but not fully, but also constructivist approach is useful, which simply allows us to interpret the facts that realists deliver. And this way, at the beginning of the 20th century, was shown by Marx that a certain researcher constructs a vision of reality that they have in the head, which was inherited from knowledge and tradition, And that's why he does it. But if we take politicians, the things are much worse because they are not driven by reason frequently, but security politics. Those expectations change and research changes. And you should also say about one thing. Professor Kittler, I will answer him. I wrote that if we read that there is a state of non-security, lack of security, if there are threats and we don't know it, you have to have obsession. There are no threats, but we think they are big, and so on and so on and so forth. That's why in those research, you should look at the subjective sphere and at the objective sphere, the reality. That's where the real difficulty lies in recognizing some interdependence or not, I don't know. But I know that there are such works, and they are good reading because they really give us knowledge that seems objective. They are a fundament of the discipline because they create the discipline, yes. And not a youngster, sorry to label like him, who is the expert in the subject, and there are works titled Impact of Trump's Policy on Coal Excavation in China. When it comes to dangers, I will share with a reflection with you. Professor Dudkowski, who too far away because we were concentrating on dangers and we respond only to dangers. We should skip away such approach. We should concentrate on our development, and when specifying directions of our development, we do everything to do like in curling, to prepare the developmental way and also neutralize threats. But in order to, if you over-concentrate on threats, you may forget the fact that you need to strive to achieve the objective and not only fend against threats. And one extra reflection, owing to my pestle, I remember how Marxists thought, and they said that you should walk like on a roof, because on one hand we have a reclining surface and on the other the same, and also does not reach as far as it should when it comes to forecasting function of science within that implementation, future implementation. Now we live probably in the times of not only risk and uncertainty. We are not only going on the roof that has two reclining surfaces, but as we say, Professor, we are going like a samurai who wants to go untouched through drops of rain. And I would like to focus on an element that Professor Szulowski introduced, the power of ideas. I may relate to the work by Richard Malcolm Weaver. Ideas have consequences, but we can simply say my probes among students showed that from 6-8 years ago, 63% did not understand the metaphor morality of Kali's mortality. When I used, these are the words of Adolf Hitler. And if media and banking are mastered non-military, for those who take the real power, security sciences become a discipline, I think, an area of science to broaden and to increase to a higher level without identity connected with theory. It may be a problem. And now in last words, I would like to relate to the white paper of national security of Polish Republic it's like a catechism of security sciences, if I use the metaphor. But if we stick to anthropocentric approach, and unlike they may be distracted or survive in scientific lingo, at that moment it seems that chances of security risks to security and dangers to security should change the name to chances, challenges of a security subject. This is my last theoretical reflection when speaking of theoretical basis.
Thank you very much. Trivial, however, referring to a human being and its drive to never-ending development, and referring to the words of Israeli professor Harari, who wrote the books 21 Lessons into the 21st Century and Homo Deus. He mentioned that a human being is very good in inventing new things, but he's completely helpless in predicting effects or consequences of those things, and taking into account functions of science, as you said, that they are descriptive, explanative, and prognostic. Wouldn't the scope of security science include some interests referring to how future inventions of human being, future interests, because we are talking about anthropocentrism all the time, how it will affect further development of mankind? There is a trivial example of the coffee espresso, that generates a lot of plastic waste, including the to the Boyd's decision-making loop. Shouldn't there be any moment of reflection before any activity, whether this activity should be undertaken at all? So shouldn't this prognostic function in security science be more developed, or is there any way, I don't know, what should we do to provide this survival and development? But in my opinion, even more difficult answer to this question is how this development should be. What does it mean, development? For some people, development could mean regress for others, so that's a very difficult category. This is one of the problems the security sciences should take into account. And of course, just like the constructivists, there could be various approaches to that. Our time is coming to its end, but we still have a moment. That's a very good question, and very important is to find the right answer. So, Doctor or Colonel, I would say that every rational activity should be driven by some analysis of whether it makes sense or not, and this action should sustainable growth, taking sake of progress, being community or the whole state. So that's a very good state, and Professor gave the answer, presenting arguments that this research should be conducted, and the research on security together with Professor Sulowski, we mentioned this. We haven't got much time. That's an important question and an important way of thinking. What Professor said brought me some reflection to me, because the social sciences are aimed at survival on mankind. But the question is, should we ask this kind of questions referring to the ice cap? But it's not only about the ice cap. The point is to understand, for example, how survival and development of the nature, leaving aside survival of mankind for a moment, let's try to consider what should we do to allow the nature to. Gentlemen, actually it's 1:00 p.m., so it's time to have the lunch break. I wouldn't like to, and we will continue this in the form of publications. And let's hope that we will continue this, that this is not the first event of this type focusing on the security sciences. We will try to continue this. Professor, thank you very much. I have very modest souvenirs as something to express our gratitude for your participation in this panel. Thank you very much, professors. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention, and I'd like to invite you for the lunch break. Lunch will be available in the hall of our conference room. Thank you very much.